when we look at Revelation 20, it obviously doesn't come just out of nowhere. There's a context there. And in fact, in your book, you say that this is the crux of the debate on the timing of the millennium, understanding the chronological relationship between Revelation 19 and Revelation 20. So can you just explain a little bit why you say that and why that relationship between 19 and 20 is so crucial?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you read through the book of Revelation, obviously what you find is the Apostle John recording a divinely inspired description of visions that were shown to him by the Holy Spirit. And so it's a friend of mine referred to Revelation as the book of Revelation is almost like future history. And so you have all of these events being recorded happening. And so when you come to Revelation 19 and moving into chapter 20, there are basically two views about the chronology. There is what we would call the sequential view of the chronology, that the events in 19 precede and are then followed by the events of chapter 20 into 21. That would be the sequential view. And then what's called the recapitulation view, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the reason that I think the issue of chronology is so important is because what you find in Revelation 19 in verses 11 through 21 is the second coming of Christ. So just think about this big picture. Chapter 19, the second coming. Chapter 20, the millennial reign. Chapters 21 and 22, the eternal state. So already you can begin to appreciate the importance of the issue of chronology. If, in fact, the events will happen in the future as they're described in these visions, then what do you have? You have the second coming, followed by 1,000-year reign of Christ, followed by the eternal state, which is another way of saying premillennialism. And so the issue really, in one sense, if you affirm that the second half of chapter 19 describes the second coming, which almost all amillennialists would do. I think post-millennialists, it's hard to, I've really done a lot more study on what do amillennialists, how do they understand Revelation 20 than post-millennialists are a little harder to nail down. But an amillennialist like Anthony Hoekema, who would be sort of a go-to guy, at least in a generation ago, he would say that everything's riding on the chronology, that if the events of chapter 20 follow the events of 19, then the Bible teaches premillennialism. So the question then becomes, well, what does the amillennials do with that? How do they understand the chronological relationship? Well, amillennials would take what's known as a recapitulation view. They would see the second coming of Christ at the end of 19, and then chapter 20, verse 1, they would say recapitulates. It goes back in time to the beginning of the present age so that the 1,000 years recapitulate, sort of give a different camera angle on the same time period of the present age. So you'd have this sharp break in chapter 20, verse 1, where it's not a sequential chronology, but rather what you have is a sharp break going back in time to the beginning of the present age. And so in one sense, the entire debate rests on that chronological debate. Put it another way, the amillennials must be able to prove that there's a chronological break at the point of chapter 20, verse 1, or else abandon as amillennialism, if I can put it very simply.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think when you mentioned, one of the things that stuck in my mind when you're talking about that is, and part of the reason it stuck in my mind because Mike Vlock has been telling this repeatedly at different points, is that it's very difficult to argue that Revelation 19 is not the second coming of Christ. You're basically running an uphill battle there. So that's almost as sure as you can get on an issue especially within Revelation. I mean, just everything that's described there,
right,
and Revelation's 19's connections to the Old Testament, and so thinking about the wording that's used there, and that's a pretty firm starting point. And then so as you're painting that picture, I think it is helpful to think about, okay, you can have recapitulation, that's one view that's often brought out, but chronological aspect seems, well, at least if we're taking most biblical books out there, chronological sequence is the most natural way. I'm not saying that there aren't other books of the Bible that depart from that, but that would be the most natural way of reading those texts. So maybe could you, it depends on I don't know how much detail you want to go in on this, but can you give maybe like a few reasons as to, how people often try to view Revelation 20 as kind of, like you mentioned, recapitulation, but your counter arguments or why we should view it as chronological sequence, which should be our default anyway?
Yeah, I would say this, Peter, and let me just build off something you mentioned just prior to your question, is I do think that's going to be helpful if some of your listeners are thinking about the book of Revelation and it's intimidating and they feel like they have to figure the entire book out in order to study this issue of Revelation 20. I do think it may be helpful to remind them of just what we've said, is that the second half of Revelation 19, if you want to look for maybe two places in the entire book of Revelation that there's a pretty decent consensus, it's that chapters 21 and 22 are the eternal state. And it's that the second half of Revelation 19 is the second coming of Christ. Now, again, I know there are post-millennial exceptions to that, but that's helpful because it really does bring some simplicity to the issue of studying the millennial debate in Revelation 20. Is you're simply, in one sense, asking yourself, are there clear indicators in the text which tell us that chapter 20, verse 1, sort of put the brakes on and go back in time to the beginning of the present age? And I would, and what you have throughout the book of Revelation are this, I mentioned earlier, this series of visions that oftentimes are introduced with the words, and I saw, and I saw. It's kai edon, usually in the Greek, and I saw. In fact, 3 times in the second half of Revelation 19, and I saw, and I saw, and I saw. And then you come to the same thing in chapter 20, verse 1, then I saw. And so same words, kai edon, and I saw. Usually in the book of Revelation, this introductory formula, and I saw, indicates what we would call historical progression, a chronological order. There are a few exceptions, but I would say is this: there's a heavy burden of proof. If you see a break from a sequential relationship, there has to be absolutely clear, compelling evidence that presses you to affirm that kind of break. What I would say is what you find is just the contrary, is what you find are, as you kind of trace from Revelation 19 into chapter 20, several sort of, I like to think of them as chronological threads that can be traced from 19 and into 20 that tie it together as a sequential chronological relationship. Maybe not the easiest, but maybe one of them would be the satanic deception. Now I'm going back a little bit, but if you read through Revelation 12 through 19, so the preceding 8 chapters, what you'll find is this future narrative repeatedly highlights the deception of the nations. In fact, in chapter 12, verse 9, you have Satan, the one who deceives the whole world, being cast down to earth. He has a short time. He enlists the beast and the false prophet. And in chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 16, chapter 18, chapter 19, deception, deception, deception. Planao is the Greek verb. Planao, 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 planao. You have this work of satanic deception. When you get to chapter 20, verse 3, the binding of Satan, now you're into chapter 20, it says that Satan is locked in the abyss so that he would not deceive the nations any longer. Now that any longer there tells us that it's interrupting this deception that had already been taking place. And so what you see is, again, I look at this as a chronological thread. You have this historical progression in which the binding in chapter 20 is designed to halt this very deception that's been repeatedly described in chapters 12 to 19. The illustration I use is if you're reading a narrative that's a real simple illustration that said, the dog barked at the cat, the dog barked at the cat, the dog barked at the cat, the dog barked at the cat. Then the man locked the dog in the basement so that it would no longer bark at the cat. You would see it, that chronological thread, that this is a sequence. And so I think in the same way that any longer ties together the preceding chapters and shows that there's a a historical progression. There's chronology. There's a sequence of events. I think secondly, maybe the description of the lake of fire. And, I think of the progression at the end, at the second coming of Christ in chapter 19, verse 20. Remember, what do you have there? Among other things, the defeat of the nations, but you have the beast and the false prophet cast into the lake of fire. Then you move into chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. Satan sealed in the abyss for 1,000 years. Verse 7, he's released. Verses 8 and 9, he attacks Jerusalem. He's defeated from fire on high. And then in chapter 10, what happens to Satan? He's cast into the lake of fire where the beast and false prophet already are. And so I would look again, that is a chronological thread. That here's what happens to them, here's what now happens to Satan. He's cast into the lake of fire where they previously had been cast 1,000 years earlier. And then lastly, at least in terms of these chronological threads, I'm actually leading up to what I think is the strongest reason, and I'm not there yet, but I also think of the messianic reign of Christ. We talked about the second half of Revelation 19 as being the second coming of Christ. What you find in verse 15 is a really interesting statement where John is quoting Psalm 2, but he what he says in Revelation 19, verse 15, is that at the time of the second coming, he uses three verbs in verse 15. The first and the third verbs are present tense verbs that deal with the judgment that's being meted out in the moment. So he's coming with judgment. The middle verb is a future tense verb. It stands out. That verb is that he will rule them with a rod of iron. And so here is John describing the second coming, quoting Psalm 2, saying he's coming in judgment and he will rule future. He will rule future from the time of the second coming. He will rule them with a rod of iron. And then what's the thread? How is it picked up in chapter 20? Well, in verses 4 to 6, it speaks of Christ reigning for 1,000 years. And so again, and there are more that we could point out, but you have these chronological threads that are woven throughout that really hold tight this historical, future history, but this future historical progression of events that indicate a sequential relationship. Now, all that said, I think the biggest reason to see a chronological progression is really the content of the visions themselves in chapters 20, verses 1 to 6. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look at the binding of Satan, and I'm sure we'll talk about this eventually in this podcast, but the binding of Satan cannot be a present reality. It must be future. And then the first resurrection must be a physical resurrection, and therefore it must be future. So the point is this: what you have is Revelation 19, the second coming of Christ, and then these visions portraying both the binding of Satan and the first resurrection and reign of the tribulation martyrs, which must be future, which argues strongly against any kind of recapitulation. In other words, if the binding of Satan and the first resurrection are incompatible with the present state, then it can't be recapitulation. It can't be a review of the present age from a different camera angle. So again, the very passage in question itself, I think, makes it clear that there must be an historical, sequential, chronological progression from chapter 19, the second coming, chapter 20, the millennial reign, chapter 21 and 22, you have the eternal state.